This week, Jason Kikta from Automox is with us to discuss supply chains, firmware, and patching. Stay tuned for Below the Surface.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 29, being recorded on Wednesday, May 8th, 2024. Well, we're recording on May 1st. We're airing on May 8th. I'm, of course, Paul Asadorian. I am joined by our special guest co-host this week, John Lucades. John, welcome.
Thanks. Always a fun to be here.
Yeah, it's always nice to have you, John. It's good to we haven't chatted in so long, and now we're doing a podcast together, which is
Sometimes that's what it takes.
it's par for the course. Yes, absolutely. Quick announcement before we get started. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security. An on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. Also, if you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that at eclipsium.com/go. We are excited to have Jason Kikta, the CISO from Automox, with us today. Jason is the Chief Information Security Officer over there at Automox. He's served over 20 years in the United States Marine Corps. Thank you for your service, sir, which included 7 years at United States Cyber Command, designing and managing the National Counter Cyber Mission. Jason is an adjunct lecturer at Alprovich Institute for Cybersecurity Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul and John. Really excited to be here.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, it's nice to have you on the show, Jason. I know in your bio kind of spoke about probably how you got into information security, but let's hear it from you. How did you get your start in information security?
So it was a winding path, but I think for a lot of people my age, it's not all that unusual in that it was, a little bit of desire, a little bit of luck, and a little bit by accident. I'd always been interested in hacking and security and sort of that the force and counterforce nature of that we think about in our business for a long time. Even as teenager, college years, all that sort of thing. And then I joined the Marine Corps and was really focused on IT. Like that was the primary focus of my job. And before the military started building out cyber command and building cybersecurity job roles, all of that stuff was forced on the IT team, right? Like that was our job to, maintain the antivirus, to set secure configurations on our network, to fulfill reporting. So it was certainly something that I was familiar with. And then I was in Afghanistan in 2012 and was trying to get my next gig because I was due to rotate back in like April of 2013. And so I was angling to go to Europe. I really want to go. My wife really wanted to go to Europe. So I had this gig lined up in Germany. It looked good. And they gave it away to somebody who was threatening to get out. So then I had to come up with something else. And I said, hey, whatever, like I'll go to MAR4 Cyber, Marine Forces Cyber Command. So I'll go there and I'll be part of the Marine Corps contingent to Cyber Command. And so I get the orders to do that. And the day before I check out, they tell me like, nope, actually you're going to Cyber Command instead. And then I go to Cyber Command and they go, well, hey, actually that billet's been reassigned. You're going to this brand new Cyber National Mission Force thing. So, show up to this weird room and I go and I show up there with my paperwork. I'm like, hey, I'm here. I'm the new guy. I'm here to check in. And they're like, no one's checked in. There's 13 of us. I was like, well, now there's 14. And that was it. And, and it just took off and they're like, okay, so like you have a background in NSA. I was like, no, this is my first time here. This is a real neat building. Really excited to be here. And it was all downhill from there. It was just, like, well, guess you better figure it out quick. So they told me I had to figure it out. So I did. And I just, no one ever told me to stop. So I just kept going. And it turned out
Nice.
I wasn't half terrible at it.
Right into the deep
And
end, right from the
Yeah.
start.
Yeah.
yeah, and so
Really.
what kind of things did you work on there that you can talk about publicly
Oh
now?
yeah. So I mean, I could talk a lot about it, especially in the early days, because and it was I had a really unique special, the sort of experience that money can't buy, just because of sheer dumb luck timing. Because I showed up right as we were standing up the cyber mission forces, and so we're going to have these hunt teams and these analytical teams and these offensive teams, and they knew how many people were going to be on there and like roughly what they were going to do, but like they had no tactics, they had no equipment,
Mhm.
they had no tools, they had no anything. And so it was like, here you go, guy, like figure it out, figure out what they're going to do for incident response, figure out what they're going to do for hunt, figure out what they're going to do for, uh, you know, all these various mission types. And so just got going on that and, was around for a lot of the like really watershed moments of that 13 to 16 time frame, things like the North Korean attack on Sony and the stuff where um they went after the Russians went after the power plants in Ukraine, and the Russians trying to get into the Pentagon. And so, you know just again, like being wrong place, wrong time, right attitude, was able to lead and direct a lot of those missions, and figure out like what cyber command's component of it going to be, how do we fit into the bigger picture. And then the Marine Corps stole me back for 2 years from 16 to 18. And then, right, like, again, dumb luck, right place, right time. They pulled me back, and I came right back in. Right as the election defense stuff for 2018 was going on. And so
Oh,
like I was right there for
Wow.
that, and like had the opportunity to start like the public disclosure program and starting to like share Cyber Command's malware on Virus Total and tweet it out. Got to, build up the hunt forward missions, and they're like, you know, here guy, like go develop this. And I'm like, okay, like what do we have so far? And they're like, well, it's called Hunt Forward and we're going to hunt in another country. So like go. And so had to like work all of that out and get it sorted. And then, like rolling forward, like that sort of steamrolled into like, hey, we should be doing a lot more work with the private sector. And so developing this, not another info sharing program, but like let's do true operational collaboration with the private sector. So that was the focus of my duties right up until I retired in late right at the end of
So
2022.
you were the
So
one who,
and was Automox
right.
sorry, was Automox your first jump into the private sector?
yeah, yeah, I was actually
Wow.
only halfway through. I had an insane, in the military, when you're getting out, you can take all that vacation that you've saved up, all that leave. And so I was on my terminal leave. I had like 5 months because of
Mm.
too many deployments and not enough time to take it, overages for COVID, crossing the fiscal year. So like I had like 5 months, and I was halfway through and like climbing the walls, and my wife was like, okay, time to get a job now. And so yeah, I landed at Automox. This is my first foray into the private sector for the last 18 months, and I love it. It's so much fun.
Awesome. John, do you have a question?
Yeah,
Sorry, I
no, no
interrupted you.
worries. I was going to ask if you were the one who was actually right there at the beginning when Cyber Command started tweeting out the indicators and posting stuff on Vibe. That was
That was me.
you doing
That
it.
was
I
my
am
thing.
glad to meet you virtually, and I'd like to shake your hand because I was been watching that for years, and I was like, "Holy cow! They actually did it! Wow!"
Yeah. Yeah, it started out. The funny thing is that the way that came about. So it had been something where I had been thinking about it when I left in 16, about like how can we get ahead, and how can you like, like our mission at CNMF was to disrupt
Yep.
these foreign state actors, and like get ahead of them, right? And so that was what counter cyber meant. And so there are a lot of ways to do that, right? So people typically think of like, oh, you're gonna, break into their infrastructure and break it, and it's gonna be this, cyber pew pew, and
One
there
way.
is some of that. Like that is a thing
That
that
is one way.
can be done, but it's not as easy as people always think it is, because you're not dealing with unlike, right, like people confuse that like opportunistic access is really easy, so therefore targeted access must be easy as well, and it's not, right?
Mhm.
Like we've all I think we're all have a sense of frustration that things are we're still dealing with a lot of security challenges that we were 10 years ago, but the reality is over the last decade things like memory safety and sandboxing and all and better default configurations, easier patching, like all of that has advance the state of the art forward to where targeted exploitation is still really difficult to do. So I was trying to think of different ways to do it. And I was like, man, like if I could just like take their malware and dump it out there while they're really early in a campaign and like make it just that much harder for them
Now everyone
to
will
avoid
detect it.
getting caught.
Everybody
Yeah,
knows.
right.
We're
And
not
I like to
special
do these
now.
things.
They can catch you.
Mhm.
Yeah. And my philosophy too was, like espionage is a thing that states do, right? Like that is a normal part of
Yeah.
statecraft, always has been. So I wanted to look for things where, we wouldn't come off as hypocritical and where, they could like turnabout's fair play. And if they did it to us, it wouldn't cause some disproportionate effect, or we wouldn't have to say like, oh, that's unfair. And so I, thought about it. I was like, like this one, like,
Totally what you should
you know,
expect to happen. You do
yeah,
this in the
right.
private
Like I think
sector,
it's
they're gonna
yeah,
share
great
indicators.
use of tax
Why shouldn't
dollars,
we?
great way to work with
I love that.
industry.
Mhm.
If they do it to us, like I got a bigger budget for malware probably than they do, like go for it. So, this kind of stewed in my mind while I was out on a Navy ship for, a couple years, floating around in the Caribbean and the Med and the Red Sea and the Gulf. And then I came back and we were talking. We were doing the election security in 2018, and I was talking to General Hawk, who was running CNMF at the time, who now runs NSA and Cyber Command, and he said, something to the effect of, you know, like, what else can we do? Like, give me something off the wall. And I was like, I want to take their malware and I want to tweet it out, sir. And he's like, can we upload it to Virus Total? And I was like, heck, let's do both.
Nice.
so so we did both. We put the malware on Virus Total, we put the IOCs on Twitter and pointed over to the link, and that's how the program was born.
Did
And then we just started developing from there.
did you get much pushback when you started doing that? Because that was a major departure, and
Oh my
it was
God.
so like, oh my gosh, somebody
Woo!
did it. I love this.
The pushback was intense.
That's
It
what I
was
thought.
so
Mhm.
intense, and it was just like, and it got misinterpreted in so many ways, like both internally and externally. Like, like internally, there was a lot of fear of like, hey, like, we shouldn't be sending out classified information. We're like, we're not. Like, first of all, these are coming from defensive missions. They undergo a declassification review. They undergo an equity review. Like, we're not just like randomly pulling them out of some repo and just YOLOing it. Like, there was, actual like legally enforced process that we went through to do it. And then there was confusion on the outside. So I inadvertently ruined opening day for of the NFL for most of the cybersecurity in 2019, because what happened was the North Koreans, when they attacked Sony, like it was like, I want to say like right before Thanksgiving, and the things kind of flared up around at Christmas time. So like I had my holidays ruined back in 2014, and I
Mhm.
stewed on that for 5 years because I'm a Marine and I'm bitter and I can hold a grudge till the heat death of the sun. And so I was trying to think of a way to get them back. And we'd been talking about, hey, we've been releasing Russian malware, we've released some Iranian malware, like let's do some North Korean malware. And so then we looked at the calendar, we're like, when are we going to do it? And I was like, let's pick a holiday. Like, let's pick a really good holiday and screw up their holiday. So we did the timing of like, okay, here's their big national holiday. And it's like late August, early September. I can't remember which, and it's on this Monday. So like, let's figure out like evening in Pyongyang, like when are they going to be like good and drunk, and like that's when we'll drop the stuff. And then we back timed it, and it comes out to be like Sunday morning in the U.S. So like, happy little me tells the team go, and like we release it, and like what I had not perceived at the time, because I was just in like the initial stages of talking to industry and like building out the program, was that hey, when the U.S. government releases something on a weekend, the world perceives that as an emergency.
Mm.
So like vendors have to answer RFIs from customers. They got to put out reports. They got to prove that they have coverage on this stuff. And like, I wasn't even paying attention. Like, oh, it's, opening weekend for the NFL, first games this afternoon.
Oh my
Like, my
god.
friends were just like, they still give me crap about it to this day because I, I got them so good
As
and
they
didn't
should.
even mean to, right? I was just like, I'm going to stick it to the North Koreans.
Yep.
And like, oh yeah, I also got you.
Well,
Whoops.
you
Sorry.
had good
Little
reason.
splashback
Yeah,
going
yeah.
there.
But like it's those unanticipated things of like, hey, can't do it on a weekend, don't screw over people's Fridays, don't dump it on them first thing on a Monday morning. So like changing the timing around that, and then and then it all kind of like we had some other like uncontrolled vectors, like we had the we wanted to do some like spicy memes, and of course, like no way that was getting
No, that
approved.
Oh
was
So
approved.
man.
No,
we
I
did like
know.
some graphics and stuff, some like mildly amusing things. Like the public affairs office has like a thing, and they just do it right. Like it takes them like a couple hours. They have like graphic designers for all kinds of like internal use, right? Like you have briefings and things, and you have international things and interagency things, and like you just don't just like use like PowerPoint clip art for that. Like there are professional graphic designers that work at the fort, and so we had this one that we designed and we had it like scheduled, and then somebody like foia it and like misread, like it was my email that they foia that got out there, and they misread it and thought that like we had spent a month to develop this one-off graphic that was literally like 10 minutes of me and the public affairs officer chatting in front of a whiteboard about like what's amusing enough that people will pay attention to it, but like let's just do something quick, and then like okay cool, and like send it over the graphic artist, but they misread my original email to think like we had spent a month on this image, and then like John Oliver's talking about it on TV and there's news articles, and I'm just like, oh my god, my general's like spinning in circles losing his mind, and I'm like, why what like so
Yeah.
it's one of those things of like when you're in government and you're kind of out there working without a wire, like no good deed goes unpunished, and like people can misperceive things
Did you
shockingly quickly.
did you get to bring any of that, lessons learned or some of the um, experience that you had there into the private sector? Did that translate easily, or was that so totally different?
Yeah, no, it translated really well. I would say that like when you're doing the, sort of like cybersecurity and related things for Cyber Command, NSA, that like what private industry is doing is not all that different, right? The sources and methods are a little more unique. The resources for some things are much higher, the resources for other things are much lower, right? Like you want to pay a high salary, too bad, right? But oh, you want to spend $1 million to do this wild thing, like no problem. So some differences in that, but all in all, like the mission outside the building doesn't look all that different from the mission inside the building, and the two complement each other well. And I think like again, like being just dumb luck, right place, right time, like seeing the great opening up of the culture inside NSA and Cyber Command to the outside world, like the two have kind of grown together now to where like that public private collaboration has really grown, and like the two are really symbiotic at this point, right? Like if you try to do, unentangle them, lots of bad things would happen on both sides of the fence because they've kind of grown together, and I think in a good and healthy way where no one's asking anyone to do anything improper or anything like that. It's just like you know the when you get down to the nub of it, the ability of the United States and its allies, like across Five Eyes, to bear any costs of improved cybersecurity and be able to defeat that for a specific like governmental purpose, like that's a cost that we can well bear, right? Whereas if we raise all boats, we're still going to be fine, but we make it harder for the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese to operate, and so that's like inherently healthy for the world.
Jason, in your role today, I wanted to pick your brain and get your perspective on how enterprises are dealing with and thinking about supply chain and or firmware issues today.
Yeah, so that's where I think my specialized perspective causes me to look at it a little different. So like the XZ backdoor thing that recently
Oh,
happened,
yeah.
that's a
Sure.
great example of, I think a lot of people look at that in the private sector and they're like, wow, like this is way out there. This is, exotic of, hey, they spent, what was it, like 3 years, co-opting this guy and getting this access in order to be able to do this thing. But like, you got to think about it. Like, it's probably a state actor. I'd put my money on SVR, but any large intelligence agency, like most of them have a human intelligence component, and so like it's not it's not weird to go over to them and go, hey, do you want to do a joint thing together? Like, you just sit behind a keyboard and it's very occasional, and you just need a few of you, and we'll develop these handful of personas, and one will be the person
Yeah.
trying to get in and the other ones will be trying to like create pressure to shape them in. And so,
Yeah. Jason, my gut was that it was not just one person. I think it was referred
oh yeah,
to in
it's
a
a
lot of the
team.
articles, right? It's a team. When I read
Yeah.
through the details, I was like, if it's one person, man, that person's really super intelligent, right? But I'm like, more likely it's a team of people brainstorming, on a whiteboard or virtual whiteboard to accomplish
Yeah.
that mission, right?
Yeah, and working off of scripts and scripts that are,
Yeah.
like, go well into the
Right.
future of, they might not have specific words worked out for what are we gonna tell them next month, but, month over month over month, how are we going to shape this person's perception of reality so that they feel like they need to make a decision. They're highly motivated to make the decision, and the only logical decision is the one which we have laid the obvious choice there in front of them, right? Like, that's
Mm.
how intelligence agencies work. Because, again, not great at always retaining the best talent or paying good salaries or having decent parking or allowing you to have your cell phone handy. But what they are really good at is, let's go do a thing that's going to last 3 years, 5 years, a decade. Like, that's their bread and butter because they develop it as a program. People come in and out, but like, they're picking up a persona package that tells them, this is who I am, this is who I'm operating on, this is my, the psyche and the kind of attitude that I'm going to have. Like, all of that is pre-scripted out. And so, like, that thing is a light lift for a government, but it's very hard for it would be hard for the public sector to the private sector to replicate it. And it's also hard for the private sector to defend against that sort of thing. And so that's why, supply chain security is so critical, because like, this is obviously fertile ground. It's gotten a lot of attention, especially post solar winds.
Yeah.
A lot of people are really focused on this, but that hasn't made the environment terribly less permissive for government actors. They just have to be a little bit more careful, right? Like, I'm willing to bet if we had a good time machine, we'd probably be able to find a lot of activity further back that just was never caught or was cleaned
Mhm.
up or whatever.
That's
And
one of the important ones, right? I
yeah,
first thing that struck me when I saw all this was, yeah, this is the one that somebody randomly got super lucky and went and
Yep.
started digging and then started to find the earth started unraveling.
yeah,
And I was
yeah,
like, for the one time that in it was, you know, 500 milliseconds of additional latency. And
yep, yep.
that's what did it. I totally know people, and I'm sure you know people, that
Hmm.
half a second of latency, yes, that definitely sets them off. And they're the sort of people
Well,
who
they
do
were
this.
lucky. Yeah, but they were that person, and I can't remember the person's name, the researcher from
Microsoft, yeah.
Microsoft, was doing performance analysis, I think with
Benchmarking.
Postgres and
Yep.
benchmarking,
Oh,
and just happened to
happen
be
to be looking at
paying attention
this.
to latency. Like, the
Yeah.
project centered around him paying attention to latency,
Yep.
and when he discovered that latency, he was like, "I need to investigate because this is part of the project that I'm doing," and then was like, but I think to his credit, he pursued that as like
Yes.
something weird, and
Yep.
I think probably figured out it wasn't necessarily related to his performance testing, but something else, and continued to pursue it for the
Pursued it
greater good.
into the open
Yeah,
source projects where a
yeah,
lot of
Yep.
folks would totally just accept, well, I don't control that. My boundary ends over here. I can't do much about whatever
yeah.
XZ is doing. And,
Right.
and
It
this was
recalls
not a
conversations with penetration
right.
testers and findings of a vulnerability in open source, but it's part of an engagement. And in their contract, they're like, I can't tell the open source project, but I can tell the company who had that, and then it's up to them to tell them, and it's like, 50-50, or I'm just making up numbers. It's not 100% of the
Yeah.
time that the client goes, "I'm gonna report this to the open source project," which they should, but they don't.
That's what
Yeah.
makes me wonder about the level of effort. Like Jason, you were talking about for this sort of
Yeah.
thing. Is this really a difficult thing, or do you think this is
It's
like there's 100 more of these that you just haven't found?
so that's the rub, and that's the trade-off here, is that executing this, as far as like getting it done for that whatever government agency it was, and again, 3 years of effort for getting burned within a month, like that's the calling card of SVR if I ever heard it, because that's exactly how those guys roll. But like, then now we flip over to the other danger, and like here's where it's the hard part, and here's why I don't think you see like even a lot of governments with malicious intent engage in this, is like, what did everyone start doing? They started like ransacking every open source project that they
Yeah.
could find, like looking for similar behavior, looking for, indicators that sort of matched up, because the idea is like, well, if you're going to build this, like why not build it for scale? So like that's the rub, is that like there are a great many things that, where governments have an advantage because of their construct versus the open source or the commercial construct. But then the flip side is like once that gets exposed, now you have other things exposed, and like, and that can lead to all sorts of problems, because like here's the thing, right, is like if they did the XZ backdoor thing to, get into this one instance of SSH, and like this, I just got to get in this one network, just this one right here, I'm going to use it very sparingly. But then they've done five more of these things that are on dozens of other targets that are lower priority or whatever else. And then those get caught and exposed and shut down, right? Like now that one, scaling that one, which is a natural impulse to do, has now cost you a massive amount of access, right? And that's the nightmare scenario that they try to avoid, of, hey, like don't use this piece of malware on this sensitive target on these less sensitive targets, because of, law of scale, there's 50 of them and one of us. If one of those 50 gets lucky, I'm now going to get burned out of not just those 50, but the one that I really can't afford to be burned out of. And they have to like calculate through that
That
as
right
well. So
there,
there's,
that's the trade-off
yeah,
that you were talking about earlier with the
yes,
tweet to virus total.
right,
Suddenly,
right,
that one thing that gets burned is now
yep,
costly. And
yes,
previously, if you do the thing that Paul is talking about, and you find the vulnerability in the open source project, but nobody tells anybody, well, it didn't cost you anything. No big deal. Okay, we'll just do the
right,
next thing. This is about actually making it, you know, matter, making it
hmm,
making the work that we do as defenders matter, but also
right,
making it matter to the adversary that this actually got caught.
yeah, and
Yeah,
and
and
you,
it's interesting, have we shored up our defenses enough? And you hinted to this earlier, Jason, right? Have we got some more memory safety? Have we got better detections that we're pushing attackers to? And I've always believed this is true, and I'm curious your thoughts, right? We're pushing them towards supply chain attacks. We're pushing them towards embedding themselves in firmware and earlier stage access before the operating system loads, because we can detect and in a lot of cases prevent these other attacks because of advancements in our own processes and technology.
I think we've definitely pushed them into harder and more challenging areas that require a lot more resources and time investment, because, like at their heart, right, intelligence agencies, government contractors that work for these intelligence agencies, all these actors, these APTs out there, like they're all government or quasi government, and they're going to do what government people the world over do. And I say this as a former government person myself, and that is they're going to take the path of least resistance, right? They're going to do it, some of them because they're not truly invested in getting the job done, and others because, hey, I've only got, even when you have a lot of, like, even when you have the resources of NSA, which are considerable, they're still finite, right? Like there's still only so much that you can do or accomplish. You still have only so many operators, only so much infrastructure. And so, they're going to shape their operations towards things that are easily achievable and low resource. And as we shape them into things that are, less achievable, higher resource, lower capacity, like that's the inherent good. Like it's not like we never reach that panacea, like we never win, right? Security is not a game that you win, but we can shape it into a place where, hey, they have to be really selective. They got to make it count. They have to go over after the targets that really matter. And that's where I think we sort of inherently change the landscape, where we shape everyone the world over, friendly and adversary, into a healthier behavior where, hey, I'm only getting on things that have a clear tie to national security. I'm only getting on things like, I'm not going to use this for economic espionage. I'm not going to use this to persecute some, dissidents. I'm going to use this for the
How
like the
much does it
statecraft that
really
really
matter?
matters.
It's got
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
ROI
And
at some point, right? They might have a budget with a few more zeros on it, but they still have to
right,
calculate ROI too. And
right. And so
if we
yeah.
don't, as defenders, increase the cost, well, then that's the calculation says they
Mhm.
should use it all over the place. This is, well, no big deal. Well, so it's almost
Absolutely. And I
part of
think
our
that's where like
responsibility to actually do something about this that is detectable and have something out there to make it. Do you really, really want to go after this? Really?
right. I think that was what had so many people alarmed about, some of these groups like NSO group, making it affordable for countries or even agencies in countries that couldn't afford it before allows them to go after, it suddenly becomes not about, hey, I need to, my number one job is to, defend myself against some external aggressor. Now it becomes like, oh, I'm going to do some internal repression. I'm going to
Mhm.
do some things for economic gain. I'm going to, engage in all these unhealthy things. And so like the more that we like, cost imposition isn't just a government game, and it's not just about, I'm going to knock over your
Right.
infrastructure that, by the way, is probably templated and very easy to rebuild, right? I'm going to, find ways to like increase the friction over time. And I'm going to use the things that are immediate as sort of a trading space or time. Like that's my holding action, but I'm going to implement these like bigger picture things that are going to make it more challenging. And so like that's where I see, when I look at what the government's doing and what industry's doing, like I see efforts like, like the stuff that I used to do at Cyber Command, that is the immediate stuff. But what we're really doing is we're buying time for things like CISA to get, secure by design and secure by default off the ground, right? For the White House to come out with this memo saying like, hey, like you really need to focus on memory safe languages. And like right now it's a memo, and then it'll be, a contract requirement, and then it'll eventually be a regulation. Someday it'll be law. Like that's the normal progression of those things. So, we have to buy time for those things to take effect,
Mhm.
because they take a long time. And as we all know,
Well,
like just because
re-
somebody's shipping it doesn't mean someone's putting it in production and taking down old stuff. But like that's how we win over the course of decades. Win as far as, dramatically improve the state of cybersecurity.
how do you see that in the supply chain, where you look at the changing the landscape so that you can actually win in the set of stuff that people. I mean, what I usually say about supply chain is it's something that almost trains people to stop looking at it, to overlook it, that
Right.
I'm going to use your stuff so that I don't have to think about it.
Mhm.
That's the whole point.
Right.
So
Right.
how do you sort of get into that, or do you see anything that we're doing anywhere that is actually changing the landscape for that?
So, I think on the face of it, like just increasing awareness alone, and building up some higher degree of vigilance than we've had in the past, like that right off the bat, you know, has a material improvement that already starts moving things forward into a
You
better
have to
place. But
acknowledge you have a problem,
Mhm. Yeah, you have to right. Like step one is admit you have a
right?
problem, but then you have to get into, I think there's a lot of things where like assuring the security of the supply chain for, say, open source software that I'm going to incorporate into a new feature, or you're going to build into a product, like that's still within corporate best interests, right? Like I wouldn't want to get a buggy project, right? Like no developer or engineer worth his or her salt would say like, "Oh, I'm just going to accept this thing that's buggy and crashes all the time," right? And so like that's good. They apply that engineering diligence, that performance diligence. The security diligence should go right alongside. I mean, and that's how like at Automox, like that's what we do with ours is like the security and the engineering diligence run side by side, and they're comparing notes because also it helps them identify things. And I've had the security team find, hey, there's a performance thing that you might not have
Hmm.
gotten to
Yeah.
yet in your testing, and them saying like, hey, this looks a little off, can you take a look at it? So
Mhm.
I think there's some things that you can solve through better process. And then, I think on some level, eventually we do have to get to some degree of liability, but that's a really fraught issue. But there's just,
This is talking about it all the
it's
time.
they're talking about it all the
Yeah,
time. Like the government's definitely, thinking hard about it,
mhm.
but it's
But it's
really
hard.
hard
Yeah.
between like, yeah, it's very hard to say like what is the required due diligence and what is
Right.
negligence.
How much is enough?
And yeah, and like if security were truly a market motivator, right, there would be a lot of vendors out of business, right? Like people like us sit around and talk all the time about like, oh my God, they had how many bugs in what time frame, right? Like there's clearly some companies out there who haven't made that investment, don't make it a priority, and then their customers pay the price. So, how do we eventually introduce that? So there's I think there's the awareness, there's the actual like policy performance tooling around it, like how can we make it easier to do it, easier to standardize it, and then there has to eventually be strong motivations to do it. And I think they start out voluntary and they end up not so voluntary.
Do you see anything in terms of like a systematic approach that changes the game, kind of like what you were doing at Cyber Command, right? Where you put something out there and it changes the cost structure for the adversary. Do you see anything that you're doing? I mean, even Automox itself, do you see something that happens and changes how this equation works out?
I see a lot of opportunities for it in the micro. I think it kind of falls apart in the macro. And what I mean by that is
Interesting.
I think it's really easy for me to build a process and, you know, enforce it enforce it with an iron fist inside Automox, or for someone to, say purchase Eclipsium and focus on their hardware supply chain security. But like the rub is that when you extrapolate that out to all software vendors, when you extrapolate that out from the United States to the rest of the world, when you extrapolate that out from you know seed round startups all the way up to long past IPO Fortune
Fortune.
500
Yeah,
companies, right? Like one size doesn't fit all,
fair.
and it grows and it evolves, and I think that where it tends to fall down the most, and this my personal perspective, I think this is where we really miss it, is too often I've seen people try to develop like this is the one ring to rule them all, right? Like
Mm,
if we just do this, this will
yeah.
be the thing that finally solves it. And where they don't realize is, because I saw this all the time at Cyber Command and inside DoD, what they don't realize is like n- nothing is ever static, nothing is ever good enough over time, and you have to continually refresh that well, right? Like the number of supply chain security things that I've seen the Department of Defense do from when I joined as a shiny young teenager back in the 90s to when I retired is just like astounding,
Mhm.
right? And we're talking everything from you know, like gear and material supply chain to, trying to figure out for the millionth time, like, okay, are these real Cisco routers, or are they gray market, or are they black market? Trying to figure out, is this piece of open source software safe to use? And if that package is safe, if that program is safe, like is the one I actually downloaded and have on my machine and I'm about to incorporate, is that one safe? Do I have the real
Two
deal?
different problems,
Like that's
Mhm.
both
yeah,
important.
and and the thing that, like, always where I gained a bit of a reputation at in my old job was people would bring something to me and go, "Hey, here's the thing you've asked for, you know, it's done. Here's the, here you go use it." And I'd look at it and be like, "This is garbage.
Mm,
Like, I can't use this. This is antiquated." And they'll be like, "No, no, like you wrote the requirements 3 years ago." I was like, "Well, yeah, 3 years ago I didn't know what I knew now, or 3 years
right.
ago, the threat wasn't what it was now." And like, like it's great. Like 3 years ago, this would have been
Yeah.
sufficient, but it's been 3 years and this is no longer any good. What I actually need is this. And by the way, I need
Yeah.
you to hurry up because if you come back in
Mm,
more than a year from now, I'm going to tell you that's garbage too. And so, I would almost say more important than the particulars of your supply chain program today is coming up with a strategy to determine, is it still working? Is it uniformly enforced? Do I have provable artifacts of that? And how am I going to reevaluate it and update it to current best practices or new knowledge in the future? Like, that's the part where it really falls down. Is I've talked to a lot of friends who come in, new job as a CISO or director of security or whatever at a company, and they get told, yeah, all these programs are in place, the stuff is built, it
Mm.
exists, we have it, we're doing it, and they're not being lied to. But what they fall in on is 3 years old, 5 years old, a decade old, and it's not really relevant to today's threats. So that's the piece where I feel like too many people miss it. Is it's They get very focused on having it and not enough on, I'm going to build
Maintaining it.
something that refreshes and maintaining it, right? The
It's
maintaining
almost
is
like that
really
open
the
source project that we all use
yeah,
right.
from,
yeah.
how's the XKCD say it?
Yeah.
The one guy who's, been doing
Oh,
this
I
for
used to, yeah,
20
I
years.
used to know the number. Yeah, there's a number for that one. But, Jason, you got me thinking. It's interesting. You talked about, and John did too, the kind of macro level things that we can do. You know, publishing signatures and uploading to Virus Total had, moved the needle in just that
Mm,
one thing. Jason Healy talks about how Microsoft's Patch Tuesday
mm,
moved the needle in
did.
a huge way
Oh, yeah.
because it's a monolithic operating system, right? It pushed everyone and moved that needle. When we get into supply chain, and you think about how many vendors and supply chains exist just in the laptop that's sitting in front of me, right? In the software stacks that we're using in our enterprise, all the little bits and components that we have, those macro level solutions are much harder.
Yeah, they are. And, like, I mean, even just to think about, if I have an open source project, where do I store my code, right? Like, think of how many, like, nowadays, all the cool kids are on GitHub, but,
Yeah. If GitHub
before
has a
that.
problem, we all have a problem, right?
Right, right, and, before that, it was probably, SourceForge, and before
Yeah.
that, it was,
Mhm.
what was that old
SourceForge
GNU
did have a
thing?
pro it's interesting,
Yeah,
SourceForge did have a problem recently, right?
yeah,
Mhm.
and so, like, you can't even get a level of uniformity on where software is stored, let alone on, here's the level of diligence that we're gonna perform, here's how we're gonna prove that with artifacts, here's how we're gonna, you know, attest to the level of security, and should I self attest or should someone else attest on my behalf, and if so, like, who's paying for
Yeah.
that? Right? And
Yeah.
And how does it
I feel
evolve
like
over
there's just,
time? Like you were just saying, what was
yeah,
good
how does it evolve
yesterday
over
doesn't
time?
necessarily work now.
Right, right. And so, just like the certifications that were the new hotness for the industry 10 years ago are not so exciting today. Like, it needs to be refreshed and we need some standardization. And when I say standardization, I actually am very hesitant about one size fits all, that this is the one true way to do it. I think actually a diversity of approaches would be the most beneficial, but we have some, like, immediate constraints to solve around, like, who's funding it, what's it going to do, what is it to cover and what is it not covering, do people actually understand that difference? And it's just, I feel like that's where, like, the open source community has changed the face of computing.
Yeah,
Right? Like, I
totally.
Mm.
remember my first copy of Linux back in like 1999 and just having my mind blown and look at where we are today. But we've never quite fully caught up to, how do we make sure that what's getting fed into the CI/CD pipeline, whether it was an outside project or whether it's something that my own engineers are developing themselves, is really and truly what we expect it is. And like, internal processes are easy to move, but to your point, John, like, I'm using this thing so that I don't have to spend time recreating it from scratch or going through every little detail on it. And like, at some point, like, you got to ship code. And so, how do you do that at scale, and for not just like the big, like, household name projects, but even for these little ones that people have forgotten about or never knew existed, that feed into some very critical things like OpenSSH.
Things that people,
Yeah, I feel like my like my coffee analogy is relevant
yes,
here, and especially John, to your comment about how, like, we want to shed some of that responsibility and just, like, pick up a component, because then it's like someone else supplied that to me. And I go in the convenience store and I go to the refrigerator and I take out that pre-bottled, glass container that's sealed nicely, cup of coffee. I have a higher degree of confidence that that won't have any ill effects because, well, one, there's regulations around it. I think we'd be
Hmm.
remiss to talk about how regulations can impact that, right? The FDA regulates the distribution, sale, and processing of all of that. And you could say whether they do a good job or a bad job and in what different sectors they might do. But like, for my whole life, I don't think I've ever gotten sick because I took, coffee from there, right? There's an expiration
Right.
date on it, right? It's in the company's best interest to make
there's a
sure the
label
ingredients are good,
with
and there's a label
Yeah.
on it
nutrition
that tells you what the
facts.
ingredients
But yeah,
are, right? There's a lot of measures that the companies put there largely because of regulations, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it. You see that with the EU CRA.
mm,
You saw that this week with the UK banning like really ridiculously weak passwords is their proposal.
Hmm.
nice.
Actually, I think it passed as a
That's
law.
awesome.
I don't know if it passed. I think it did pass. I was going to cover it this week. So, regulations, I think, are a huge driver. And while I'd love the solution to be we all get better at technology because I'm a nerd, I think part of this solution is also regulations that force people to do the right things.
Yes. Yeah, completely
Change
agree.
that
Um,
trade-off again. Make it worth your time to do the right things as well.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
make
No,
it
agreed.
less worth their
Yeah.
time for the adversary to do it, to do the wrong
Yes.
things.
And I think too often people like, it's very easy to poke holes in any proposed
Oh
regulation
yes.
or rule to say, what about this exception, that exception? But and that's fine, and we should try to do the very best that we can, but at some point it becomes a recipe for inaction, and we've been stuck on inaction for the past couple decades. It hasn't
Mhm.
worked out well so far, and I'm not really sure why it would work out better in the future.
This is
Right.
where I actually look at what you guys are doing and even what we're trying to do. And I sort of see what you're saying about the future where things are going to be different tomorrow. Things have to change. You need to build a program that isn't just for today and solving the problem right now, but it has to persist in a way that's going to be different tomorrow. And that's okay. We need to somehow have a way to do that. I think one of the things that you guys do is to try and put a common way of getting at just about
Hmm.
anything, right? Like you have all of these
Right.
different um, uh, ways of accessing, ways of configuring, ways of securing, and there's one way to get at it so that you don't have to learn 600 different things. In many
Right.
ways, that's the same thing for the firmware and hardware that we're trying to do at Eclipsium. And I think
Hmm.
in a way, you could apply the same logic to a program. And you can sort of say, well,
Right.
it's the program. It's going to change tomorrow. There's going to need to be three you know, ways of doing this. But you go to the program does it.
Yep. Yeah, and like this, yeah, I've been doing computing for a long, long time, a long time. I mean, since
You hate
probably
computers
junior
yet?
high was when I got into it
Yeah.
seriously, right? And
Yeah.
like, the thing that has always made me a little bit batty is that too often as technologists, we are overly focused on having on all the dazzling array of different ways
Shiny,
to do a thing,
new,
Yeah.
right?
squirrel.
Like yeah, like I'll modularize it so you can plug it together in like 50 different ways, and like that's great, but like can we just have one safe way to do it? Can we just like standardize a little bit, and maybe like not even one, like maybe instead of 50 ways we have 10. Like 10 seems good. Can we maybe do 5? And this is where I think like and I really like how CISA phrased it actually. And I know they're planning on making a big splash about this at RSA next week,
Mm,
according to that Wired article. But like, so they're talking about secure by design, but like their other concept that's related of secure by default, like that I think is really important. Of too often vendors are incentivized to ship things as you know maximum functionality right out of the box, minimum security.
yeah.
And like that's the paradigm we have to change. Of like, here it is, max security, back off until you get the functionality you want, right? Like it backing off, right? And you can have an argument about I mean, the counter argument that's obvious is, well, hey, whether I'm building up to it or backing off of it, it's the same amount of work. So why do we have to change everything? But the reality is like, no, it's not the
Nope.
same amount of work, because backing off, like I know I'm backing off of right. Building up, like I don't know what right looks like. And
You
again,
Mhm.
need
it's
a
like those little
roadmap.
things
You
of,
need experience.
is it
It's a
a
lot of pain.
toggle button? Yeah. And it like, is it a toggle button, or is it, some radio switches, or is it like a text input box, or is it a script, right? Like if I have to get a script right, we're probably screwed, because I love my typos, right? If I have a text input box, like that's still higher danger than just like a little toggle switch that says, yep, turn that on,
All those
right?
There was a great question when I presented at a conference recently, and it ties in what we're talking about. In that, I think one of the problems that we have is that vendors, like in suppliers of technology, want to have lots of features, and they want people to use all those features so that they continue to buy the products, update the products, and stick with that particular brand.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think that causes two things. It's what we're talking about here, that we get all the features turned on because we want the user experience to be good and
Right.
sticky,
Yeah.
and go, oh, I appreciate that feature. And also, someone pointed out as a question in my talk that that's why we get security updates and feature updates all as one, because it's an incentive
Yes.
for the consumer to update,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? I want the new shiny Apple iOS feature, but oh, by the way, you're getting like a couple hundred megs of security patches with that too. But if it was just a security patch, would most people apply it? I mean, we collectively on this call, we would, right?
Hmm.
But with the larger population, probably
Well,
not. So there's incentives are
the
wacky in
incentives are
this context.
huge as a driver and as a stopper for all of these things. One of the bigger things was when we had browsers introducing these automatic updates that I don't have to click on.
Right.
And that made a huge difference. Just like you were
Hmm.
referring to earlier, Patch Tuesday made a huge difference. Now I could predict when I'm going to have to deal with all this. Um,
Right. Yeah, because not everyone's like us. Like every time I sit in front of my Linux computers, the first thing I do is like I build it into my day that I'm gonna do
Yeah.
updates,
yep,
right? And I build in extra
yep,
time going, if something goes wrong, I'm gonna either deal with it or switch to a different computer,
pretty much.
right? Like I've got enough computers where
Yeah.
I can do that now. But that's not the norm, right?
No,
And this is
no,
what
like
Jason's talking about. If you could back off to like reset to defaults was actually secure, then
Yeah,
reset to defaults would be a completely reasonable answer to a lot of things,
right.
mostly not working today.
right. Right. It's just, I think
But
we've just,
that's also why I think people are hesitant to apply patches too, because they change the features we're using, and we're using so many features,
yeah.
right? And if they're enabled by default, people could be using those features, and so
Mhm.
turning off, you're like, am I gonna break
What am
something?
I going to
Because I've got
break?
all this wonderful functionality, right? I haven't built from 0 and gone up. I started at 100, and now
Yeah.
I gotta back down and worry about what
Yep.
I'm gonna break. Therefore, I'm concerned about when I apply a patch to anything, hardware, software, firmware, whatever it is, like which one of those 100 things are gonna break.
Yeah. And like, that's what's been really interesting for me working at Automox. And being older, older than most of the people in the company and having some history behind this, is I remember 20 plus years ago when the state of the art in patching was how slowly do you apply patches? How
Mhm.
deliberate is your process? How much regression testing do you do? What's your ring deployment policy look like? And like those were back in the day when most patching was touch labor. Like and when I started out in the Marine Corps on the enlisted side, like I was a hardware technician, and so like part of our thing was like how the Marine Corps was catching patching back then was like hardware needs to go into servicing fairly often. And so when somebody comes in because the CD-ROM died or the hard drive, stopped spinning or is making noise, like part of our thing was apply patches while you have
Yeah,
that thing on your bench, right? And
right.
so that used to be the mindset. And then as awareness about security grew, and then auto update became somewhat ubiquitous, we went from
Yeah.
patch rarely to patch immediately, patch all the things, patchity patch. And that broke a lot of stuff. And so now we're kind of seeing the pendulum swing back to trying to find that reasonable default in the middle of I need to do my critical patches tonight, my highs this weekend, my mediums and lows once a month, and like my feature patches, my update patches, my non-security patches once a quarter, if ever, right? Once a year, if ever, because if I don't need that feature and if it's not broken, don't fix it. So getting to that nuance level of patching, getting to that right level of configuration where it has only enabled the level of feature that I must have for the proper functioning, like that's where the real advanced state of the art is. But like that's and it's easy for us as longtime practitioners, but like that's really hard for the industry to do at scale because there's not enough of us. There's not very many of us, and it's really hard. Like it takes years and
Even
years to build that kind of judgment and experience.
even when you have it, you have a limited amount of time. So
Yeah.
like you could do it if that was the only thing you were going to do.
Mhm.
And I think we run into that a lot where, yeah, I could set up a whole ring deployment model and go through each individually and watch the logs and make sure that it actually was okay. But I have an unreasonable set of expectations already. How am I going to add that to it? And I think a
Right.
lot of folks are truly in that position where they try, they actually have a lot of background and
Mhm.
they do spend all this time. And some of them are actually geeks that love to do this in their free time too. And you just can't do it. It's just too
Right.
much. And I think as we've exploded dependencies, I mean, I used to have a lot of fun with dependency hell on Linux, right?
Mm.
Before
Think we all
package
did.
managers were any good, right?
Yep.
So i you have that problem. It's just not well defined because you're depending on some feature in something that could be implemented 10 different ways. And so
Right.
now you're not sure what's going to break, and the only backstops you have are things that aren't exactly secure, right? You're going back to an open system instead of building up from that secure default that you were talking about, that Sis is talking about.
Right.
It's tough. I don't know. I would love to have an easy answer here, and the supply chain is not any different as part of that. It's the same thing in terms of dependency hell. Um,
Yep.
Yeah, I think at a high level in having a lot of these discussions about supply chains and patching, certainly is that, vendors need to be more of the secure by default,
Certain.
but they also need to provide a low operational risk way of patching the
Mhm.
systems. But then the responsibility on the rest of us is to actually apply those patches. And I think
Yes.
once you get like those three things humming along, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but like that's where we need to be moving towards, in my opinion.
I think
Yeah.
evidence and assurance, like being able to come back to something. I think Jason, you said it earlier. You need to have some sort of provable artifact. And
Right.
when you're lacking that, it's hard to change the incentives, right? The incentives are going to be you're doing ROI based on what you see, and if you don't see it, it's not there. So the artifact that's lacking that says this patch is going to be okay. And I know it's going to be okay because.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Because I went through the forums and I read other people who have applied patches.
That's what works
Like
for you and
literally in
me these days sometimes.
yeah,
I mean, that's all
Reddit's
you
really
got.
literally
good.
in Manjaro, you go to their forum and there's like a voting thing, and everyone that had a good experience, applying the latest update
Yeah.
will actually vote. And I will actually go there for a number of reasons. One, to see generally how people are
Yeah.
doing, and two, to see like the
Well, you got
gotchas
to find
which
what's
are
not
published
working
there.
too.
Right. But Microsoft does a great job of basically doing that for you. I mean, they do tons of testing right before it, but they've got such a vast landscape that there's edge cases they're just not going to catch, which is where you have to rely on the kind of crowdsourcing
Yeah.
because of that. But that whole process, if we keep improving that process, it'll I think breed confidence, right, in people applying patches in operations. Because us on the podcast today, and probably many of us listening, are like, well, I've been burned by patches before, and
Oh,
therefore
everyone
this
has one of
hesitation
those.
just burned into my DNA, right?
Yeah.
And everyone has this, right? Like, I apply that update to my phone and it blew up, so therefore I'm not applying updates. And all it takes is that one time
Yep.
of someone being burned to change their behaviors in the wrong way when it comes to security.
Yeah. I also think, like, again, as if we're talking long enough time scale, like there's a lot of things that we could just do better in computing. And I think like what got me thinking this direction was watching cloud technology take off, and how it turned servers. I don't know who coined this phrase, but I love it. But like turning servers from pets into livestock,
Yeah.
mind
Yep.
blowing, right? I remember being in my teens and 20s in college, and like, like that's Frodo and that's Gandalf and those are my servers, and like it's my
Mhm.
baby and nobody touches it but me. I'm the gray beard sysadmin, and like, ha ha ha, like that's my thing, right? And whereas like now, like, man, we just number those things and they all sit in AWS, like,
Yeah.
and if it's misbehaving, I just kill it
I
and
make
spin
a
a
new
new one up.
one. Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And but and I have it set up so like the new one will spin up in the default, secure configuration, patch configuration that I want it to have. And we've
It's
never
secure by default.
quite,
What?
yeah, what? Wild. But we've never quite gotten there with personal computing devices, and we've gotten close, right? Like the like mobile devices like iOS and Android, have greatly, again, like they're not without their security issues, but far more secure than the general purpose computing
Yeah.
Different
computers that we all run on
trade-offs.
our
Yeah.
desktops. And like,
Yep.
like, why do I need a general purpose computer to do my daily job, right? Why do my sons need general purpose computers to play video games, right? Like they're basically consoles. But hey, on a console, I can't do this thing and I can't do that thing, or well, I got to have this console for this and this console for that. So like, there's some things that like we're slowly kind of converging on in computing, but we're not making fast enough progress, because I mean, honestly, I thought by now, like it would all be like iOS and Android or Chromebooks on the desktop, and like that's where computing would be these days. But like, it's just, too many applications to support, too many
Mhm.
unusual use cases, and like those things aren't really, they're not really optimized for it, right? Like I have an iPad that I use as a travel laptop, and it's okay when I'm traveling, but I would lose my mind if that was my daily driver at
Yeah.
my desk. Like I just
Mhm.
I wouldn't be able to
Mhm.
stand it. So, like we still have a little ways to go into computing of like, getting out of that pets mentality and into a livestock mentality, and then, making sure that when we say livestock, that, they're all inoculated, they're all, within specs,
Yeah.
and we can rapidly deal with issues that
And they're
arise.
easily replaced. I think that
Yeah.
whole dependency issue, if you
Yeah.
have to replace something, all those dependencies crop up and rear their ugly head, and you have to deal with all of them all at once. So if you have a
Yeah. And
bunch, you can do that for your pet, but not your livestock.
right. And I think it helps us deal with the thing that like I think like a lot of us as security professionals kind of overlook, like the major friction in our lives, and the place where, kind of tying it back to what we were talking about at the beginning with my
Mhm.
having worked at an APT, the thing that APTs rely on is hiding in the noise, and users are giant entropy generators on a
Mhm.
network. So the more like good security starts with good IT, and the more standardized you can make that user experience, those user endpoints, all the things that users touch, and then administrators, and then so on and so forth, the better security posture you're going to have, because you have that predictability and you can detect those anomalies and respond to them faster.
That's awesome stuff, Jason. We're coming up on time here. I want to thank you for coming on Below the Surface and give you an opportunity to promote. I know this will air like as RSA is ending, so I was going to say we would promote RSA, but it's over by the time people are listening to this.
Yeah, so I just want to say, yeah, so it's it, I mean what I just said, and I think a lot of my friends and colleagues were surprised when I went to an IT software company instead of to a cybersecurity vendor. But I really deeply believe that, like, good security starts with good IT, and it's that's what I like about Automox, is like being at a place where our business is endpoint management, and patching and configuration is deeply meaningful to me, because I can make a difference at a scale that I couldn't in the
Mm.
government, and I can make a difference in another way. And you know uh please swing by automox.com, automox.com, and check us out. But it's fun building a better future for computing.
Awesome. Jason, thank you so much.
Thank
John, thank you as always. And that will conclude this edition of Eclipsium's Below the Surface. See you next time.